clear for the aim of public safety. And also, if you have any spare seats, please don't leave any gaps. We've obviously got a very big crowd here this afternoon. There will be signings after the session. They will be at the book signing area here at the back of the front lawns. That's in the far left corner. So the authors will be signing. Please let them walk unobstructed after the session, and they'll be happy to sign your books over there. A little bit of bad news, I'm afraid. We won't be joined for this session by Catherine Boo or Rana Dasgupta. They are both unable to attend and send their apologies. But now, please join me in welcoming for the Nonfiction Renaissance, Antony Beevor, Geoff Dyer, Reza Aslan, and William Dalrymple.
One of the most startling developments in publishing and in literature over the last 20 years has been the way that non-fiction authors have moved into the space once occupied exclusively by novelists of the role of the celebrity writer. In the old days, I think, when people talked about being a writer, they meant being a novelist. That is no longer the case. And we have on this panel some of the most distinguished practitioners of non-fiction and one practitioner of both fiction and non-fiction. Yes. I'd quickly like to say an apology to Kate Boo, who I included in this panel without her consent. She sadly won't be able to make it. But you'll be able to hear her husband, Sunil, doing some other stuff later. The fairy tale story of non-fiction success in my generation is Antony, sitting on my left, who's been working away on the coalface of the 1930s and 1940s military history since he became a writer. And then, with the publication of Stalingrad, something rather dramatic happened. Maybe you could just tell the story of how, of what happened with that book.
Well, what happened in a way was in 1995, I was in Moscow working second year of research into basically a 4-year project on Stalingrad, and it turned out to be the 50th anniversary of the end of the Second World War.
Oh, hold it in your hand.
Okay. And it turned out to be the 50th anniversary of the Second World War. And there was a huge publishing explosion, and all of the books failed to sell. So that was pretty discouraging, as you might imagine. And so therefore expectations were absolutely zero. And I remember when the managing director of Penguin sort of said, oh, well, I think this book might go over 10,000 copies. You know, all the marketing people said that's crazy. But the interesting thing was...
What date are we talking?
We're talking 1998. Anyway, the interesting thing was, of course, all the journalists immediately wanted to understand it. So they're all asking why, what's happened? And I had to start looking backwards. And I think that there was a huge change in expectations, which we hadn't realized. And it was all linked in with the end of the Cold War, all of these extraordinary revolutions which happened at the same time. The end of the Cold War, invention of the internet, the less respectful society, particularly in Europe, when people did not view, if you like, authority in the same way. And there was a general sort of flattening of the social structure, generally. And all of these things came together at that particular time, but there was also a reaction against the collective version of history. In the past, history had always been written in terms of, you know, the history of an army or the history of an industry or something like that. And what we had underestimated was the way that during that period, people talked about Thatcherism and so forth, but there was now suddenly an emphasis on the role of the individual. And I was just lucky with timing that it happened in that particular book. I was interested in the fate of the individual when they had no control over their own lives at all. And, you know, that was when sort of everything went
And maybe you'd like to describe, I mean, sorry to embarrass you, but some of the figures involved here. That book, it won, in Britain, Samuel Johnson Prize, which was a new prize inaugurated for non-fiction. Yeah. The Wolfson Prize, the Hawthornden Prize. Yeah. And as a result of that, what happened to your sales?
Well, they did certainly sort of take off. I mean, starting, well, I suppose it's nearly 2 million now.
Yeah, just in case anyone didn't hear that, 2 million copies of Stalingrad were sold. So,
well, which was, you know, when we thought of the original estimate of the publishers, it gives you an idea. They reckoned 6,000 was very good for a book of military history, which in those days, and this was the other aspect, in those days would have been a subject entirely limited to sort of retired military officers and military history buffs. What was fascinating was the way that suddenly the subject opened up, the borders had come down, and women were reading both Stalingrad and Berlin and so forth. And I think that made a huge difference, and I think this was happening throughout, or in many areas of non-fiction at that particular time, that the old barriers were dropping, and that was why non-fiction suddenly was taking over.
We should maybe just place it briefly in the context of what was happening in terms of history writing.
Yes.
There had been, since the Second World War, a move away from narrative. History writing in the 19th century was a simple matter of telling stories of battles, kings, and events in chronological orders, with possibly a chapter on culture and the economy. Yes. And you find this in Histories of Ancient India, where you have this chapter, the people, or the economy. And the kind of history that was being written from the time of Herodotus, through Bede, through Macaulay, through Gibbon, up until the Second World War, where history had implicit in it the word story. Suddenly, through the 50s and 60s, you had something quite different happening. People are writing economic history, subaltern history. Yes. You were part of a change in British history writing, which maybe Simon Sharma kicked off in 1977 with yes. Citizens.
Which was multidisciplinary, an approach which the French were shocked by profoundly. I think this was very interesting. You realize that his book Citizens has still not been translated into French. And that's basically because the readers, who were usually universitaires, they were sort of lecturers and professors, thoroughly disapproved of the mixing of disciplines. And in fact, for the French Revolution, and to understand what was involved with the scientific change, cultural change, everything from fashions through to literature, you had to bring everything together, and that's where Simon Sharma really did open things out.
And Citizens returned to the old style of history writing, and it had a narrative, it had a story, it had characters who you were interested in, who you followed through a series of events, and the end result was a book which read not unlike a novel.
And it was beautifully written. And yes, yeah. But one has that thing from sort of journalists about sort of is history the new novel? Well, I mean, no, it's not, because obviously it's got to be entirely fact. And I am worried about the way that one's seeing so much historical fiction, where people are seizing and using major characters from history, rather than, say, adopting a sort of roman clear approach. But anyway.
Reza, you had a similar experience this summer with your Jesus Man. Maybe you could tell the story of your nice encounter with Fox TV.
Right. Well, look, when you're a brown man on television talking about Jesus, you have to really calm down and be as, you know, be as unthreatening as possible.
And not just a brown man, but a brown man of a certain religion.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Look, I think that, by the way, what a great crowd. I was just going to say, what's funny about this crowd is about half of them are still waiting for Jumpa's autograph. It looks like they're here for us, but they're actually just...
It's a signing queue.
They're just in line, yeah. Right, a little bit faster, Jumpa. No, I mean, look, when you're writing about religious figures, I mean, you're dealing with a whole set of complexities that are quite different than writing about other parts of history. I mean, obviously, you're writing about people that you know, many billions of people around the world take very seriously as symbols of devotion and even worship. And so you're dealing with trying to humanize historical characters who were actually human, but who have become you know, not just lionized the way that so many historical characters have become, but actually made divine. And so when you try to write about them in their world and in their time, you're naturally going to butt up against certain sensibilities. And that's something that you just have to deal with when you're writing about religion the way that I do. I do think that there's also one other extra bit of complexity, which is that writing about Jesus is not like writing about Napoleon. You know, this is a man who is absolutely shrouded in history, the man that we know almost nothing about. And so what you have to do is take what little we can kind of be somewhat sure about when it comes to Jesus, and there's very, very little, and then use what we know about his world to fill in the holes. You don't regard
the Gospels as gospel, in other words?
Here's the thing about the Gospels, is that you have to understand that the Gospels are not eyewitness accounts of Jesus' words and deeds. These are testimonies of faith written by communities of faith many years after the events that they describe. Now, that does not mean that we don't have the tools at our disposal to try to figure out what in the Gospels is more or less historically accurate. We do, and that methodology has been in place for some 200 years. But you have to recognize that the Gospel writers already believed something about Jesus, that he was the Messiah, the Son of God, God incarnate, and then they wrote their Gospels to prove that belief. They didn't write their Gospels to present some sort of historical account of Jesus. They wrote their Gospels to make a theological argument about Jesus. And when you realize that, then that gives you the first and most important tool necessary to then be able to call the little bits of historical information that we can get from the Gospels, but it's very little. And when you remove the Gospels from the equation, you know almost nothing about this man. And so you have no choice but to rely on his world, his time, to sort of fashion this sort of new way of thinking about who he was. And when you do that, often what happens is that the image that arises bears little resemblance to the image that I think many people, both Christian and non-Christian, have of who Jesus is.
Which was one of the problems your friend on Fox TV had. Maybe, again, you could just describe this little encounter for those of you in the audience that don't know the story.
I've actually wiped it from my mind. I'm not sure even what you're talking about, to be honest with you.
It's available on YouTube, guys. I've heard that a few people have watched it. Yeah.
Look, again, I don't have. I mean, essentially, there's a big argument, not about anything that I wrote in the book, but about my right to have actually composed the book. How it is that a Muslim who also happens to be an expert on religion could write about Jesus. Which is fantastic because as far as I know, and I've been thinking about this a lot, I can't think of a single non-Muslim who's written about Muhammad. I can't, it doesn't come to mind. Anyway, I'm sure someone will try to remember one book by a non-Muslim about Muhammad. But again, this is the issue, is that, you're dealing as a historical subject, someone that billions of people believe is an eternal being. What you are saying is that context should define an individual that for billions of people has no context whatsoever. It may seem somewhat logical to say that if you truly want to know who Jesus was, then you have to know that whatever else he was a product of his time and place, that his teachings were addressed to very specific social ills, that his actions were a response to very specific political and religious leaders. And so if you truly want to understand his words and deeds, you need to understand the world he came from, because he was, whatever else he was, a product of his world. That should make sense to anyone when dealing with any other person, any other historical figure that you're writing about, except that 2 billion people believe that this person is also God. And if he's God, then he has no context. Then context is absolutely irrelevant. His teachings are eternal. His actions are eternal. So the very notion that you are putting this person in his time and place and allowing his time and place to define him, that very notion is offensive to a large number of people. And I get that. I understand that.
But the book, nonetheless, didn't do badly.
Yes, well, it didn't do poorly because I would say half of my sales were people who bought it just so they could hate it. Which is fine. I'm totally okay with that, by the way.
You're not allowed to take it out of the library.
Don't take it out of the library, leave it alone. But
but again, could we just, in a sense, to sort of steer this back into the subject under discussion? What is the situation in the US with fiction versus non-fiction? Are they selling equal?
No, it's not even close. I mean, look, unless you're Jonathan Franzen, forget about it. Or if you're writing, genre. If you're writing genre fiction, I mean, if I teach MFA students, creative writing students, and the best advice that I can give you as a young, if you're a young writer out there, young novelist out there, and the best advice that I could give you is, try to figure out a way to write a book about vampires in love. Otherwise, no, look, it's not even close. I'll just give you a very brief...
Nonfiction is in the lead.
Yeah, nonfiction absolutely dwarfs fiction sales in the United States. It's not even in the same ballpark. You could take a massive, huge #1 New York Times best-selling novel, and it would not compare to a #1 New York Times best-selling nonfiction book. I'll give you just one. I'm speaking too long, and I want to hear from Geoff. But I'll give you one very, very brief thing. So I was trained as a novelist, and when I first left school, I wrote a manuscript to a novel, and I got an agent with that novel, and we started to go out and shop that novel, and then my agent, in just sort of an offhand way, said, "Are you working on anything else? Is there anything else that you're thinking about writing?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm thinking about writing this book about the Prophet Muhammad." And this was 2003, so she, like little dollar signs showed up in her eyes, and she said, "Well, tell me more about this." Yeah. So I wrote a very brief proposal. And the proposal, just got so much attention that we took the novel off the table. We sold the proposal to Random House, and it as part of a 2-book deal. And the deal was, okay, so first you'll publish the first book, No God But God, and then you'll publish the novel. And then No God But God came out, and it was a really big sort of international bestseller. And I said, okay, great, now it's time to publish the novel. And they said, yeah. What about one more book just like this one? And so they wrote a big fat check, and so I wrote one more book like that. That was How to Win a Cosmic War. And then I said, okay, great. Now, how about the novel? And they said, yeah, that's cute. Really adorable. What about one more just like this one? So I wrote Zealot, but in this case, they were contractually obligated. I'm not kidding. They were contractually obligated to release my novel 18 months after Zealot came out. No. About 2 months ago, I was sat down by Random House and told, that's not happening. No, you're going to write one more book just like this one.
So you remain an unpublished novelist?
I'm probably like the only novelist that has actually sold their novel 10 years ago and yet has yet to see it published, which by this point it doesn't. I mean, I always say novels are not like Twinkies. They don't last forever.
Geoff, you therefore are the only one among us who is a published novelist.
Yes.
How different is the process of writing and launching a novel as opposed to a work of non-fiction these days?
Well, in my experience, it's pretty identical. You sit there and you go like that for a certain amount of time, and then a book results. So the processes are pretty well indistinguishable from each other in my experience. Can I talk about my experience as a reader, though?
Yeah, hold it up.
Yeah. Is that better?
Yeah. Yes.
To address this topic of fiction and non-fiction, I think it's worth bearing in mind. I mean, it's this thing about whether one can extrapolate from one's own experience and draw from that some larger conclusion. So I'll just tell you a little bit about my experience as a reader, really, which was that I used to read novels all the time, and then I found as I've got older, I read fewer and fewer novels, less and less fiction, and more non-fiction, and it's not even as straightforward as that. I'm pretty sure that if you're a man, as you get older, gradually all you want to read after a certain age is military history, which is very good news for Antony.
It's good for you, Andy.
Because we're all eventually going to end up in reading Antony Beevor. So that's, I think, and there's a sort of reason for that, I think. I mean, when I was a big reader of novels, in my I can so remember when I read Middlemarch when I was 19 or however old, and the extension of my understanding of psychology, morality, gesture, everything, it represented about a 50% increase in my total understanding of these things. Okay, then about, by the time you've read 300, 400 novels, each incremental novel is, coming up with a smaller and smaller percentage increase in your understanding. Whereas the nice thing about reading non-fiction is that, of course, you're at the end of it, you've learned something, you've gained knowledge. Now, the other problem is, as you get older, the length of time that you can retain that knowledge shrinks. So it's not just that you read Stalingrad as you get older, you have to keep rereading. And then I'd say something else, I think, about this phenomenon of fiction and non-fiction. And I'll start by talking about a very, great book of non-fiction, The Country and the City by Raymond Williams, which I'm sure many of you have read. And it begins with Raymond Williams reading this elegiac description of the English countryside, saying that, the old English countryside is no more. And this provokes a memory in Raymond Williams, and he thinks, I think I read something like that 30 years ago. And he duly finds the passage that this had reminded him of, and finds that there was that lament 30 years previously, and he keeps tracing it back, this elegy for the vanished English countryside, and keeps tracing it back and back and back until basically without too much difficulty, we're back in the Garden of Eden. So I think in some ways what Willie was saying is right. In the 19th century, early 20th century, when you've got Lawrence and Joyce duking it out, yes, the novel is where it's at. Lawrence makes these great claims for the novel as the great big book of life. Okay, so we can accept that. On the other hand, if we apply a slightly Raymond Williams-like take on this, particularly in America, then we find actually, several things are going on. We go back to, let's say the 19, I can't remember exactly when it came out, but yeah, there's been this consistently strong thing of non-fiction sort of reporting in the United States. So I'm thinking of a great book like Random Family by Adrienne Nicole LeBlanc, which in some ways is a sort of precursor, I think, of Kate Boo's book, The Beautiful Forevers, in a different situation. Before that, a book like Common Ground by Anthony Lucas, that came out in the 1980s. Of course, once we're getting back into the 1980s, we're not far away from the new journalism, when Capote, Mailer, and Tom Wolfe are writing these non-fiction novels. And then once you start to consider the idea of the new journalism, well, the new journalism turns out to start looking like a rather ancient form. You can really start tracing the sort of precursors of that. In other words, I think this is there's the Renaissance of non-fiction has been going on, particularly in America, for quite a long time.
For those who don't know about Capote and In Cold Blood, do you want to just talk a little about what went into that book?
Yeah. So
again, a novelist who had written a whole series of novels and novellas up to that point suddenly writes a book of non-fiction.
Sure. Well, we can talk about any of those big three, really: Mailer, Capote, or Wolfe. And God, you don't need me to tell you about In Cold Blood, where it's this very, very objective retelling of a famous murder case. But I think one of the interesting things, the kind of great controversy about these books was the extent to which the introduction of novelistic techniques had resulted in a kind of distorting of what actually happened. And I've written these weird kind of neither one thing nor the other books, and you know, in my non-fiction books, I mean, I've made a lot of stuff up, but, you know, the truth is, the kind of books I write and the stuff I've made up, it's not like James Frey or something, or it's not like If You Learnt That Guy who'd, you know, been stuck in the canyon in Utah and had cut his hand off. If you'd learned that actually he'd never even been to Utah, you might feel justifiably cheated. So the stuff that I'm writing about, this sort of navel-gazing kind of thing, it really doesn't make, the little sort of alterations I make are not really significant. So, I mean, when I'm, on the one hand, I feel a certain, because it doesn't really, it seems to me that the category distinctions between my fiction and non-fiction are not really, I mean, they're incredibly porous, let's say. It's a border that's very, very easy to cross. So on the one hand, I sort of feel like I feel like saying kind of to you know, about this fiction, non-fiction debate, you know, it's ridiculous. Nobody, I mean, how many of you divide your cupboard between socks and non-socks? I feel that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, of course, I realise there has to be a distinction, because really part of Antony's reputation depends on the fact that he is, yes, that it's not only not made up, but that it's been thoroughly, adequately and properly researched. So, you know, it really, I think it depends not just, so the division, in other words, is not just between fiction and non-fiction, but the kinds of non-fiction book you're writing. So I would have a fondness for I mean, if I could be forgiven for putting it somewhat, I mean, somewhat in the sense of very pompously, I think there might be room for some kind of notion of the non-fiction work of art, as opposed to the non-fiction work which you're reading primarily for the content, and in a sense, if it's well written, that's a kind of bonus.
But as you say, the difference with a novel is that if you read a bad novel, you've just wasted your time.
Yes.
Well, if you read a bad biography, you might at least learn something about Napoleon or Alfred the Great.
Indeed,
exactly. But travel writing is a certain crossover element. I mean, there is, Willie, I'm sure not in your case, but I mean, you know, there is a certain invented element there. But I must just add one thing about what Reza was saying. One of my favorite stories was when I decided to make a breakaway from doing another big battle or whatever, and I was fascinated by the story of Chekhov's niece. And I presented this... Olga Chekova. And I presented this to my American publishers. And they said, Anthony, that's brand disintegration.
Yes.
It's the first time I'd ever thought of being a brand, and I didn't realize I was disintegrating.
To go back to something that Geoff said, it's such an important point, because obviously when you're writing history, or when you're writing a work of journalism, even if you're writing it in a narrative sense, there is a different kind of expectation to that than when you're writing a work of creative non-fiction. And I think the blurry lines is a very, very important phenomenon of what we're talking about. And it goes both ways. I mean, some of the best fiction that is being written now, it very much blurs the line between fiction and nonfiction, just as the same is true the other way around. And I think that...
We're having a session in the festival on memoir and the autobiographical novel.
Right.
And
yes, exactly. And I think that, you know, in the end, I teach both fiction and nonfiction to my students, and one of the things that we talk about a lot is the fact that there's this misunderstanding that nonfiction, that the difference between fiction and nonfiction is that nonfiction is true, which of course is absurd, not just for the reasons that true itself means something, you know, quite different than fact, but the idea that a wonderful work of fiction cannot also be based on truth. And so what I always say, and it helps me to understand it too, is that really the difference between nonfiction and fiction is that nonfiction is tethered to reality. That while you do have a tether, you have plenty of room to actually bring in the narrative, and that truly your responsibility is ultimately to the story, because you are a storyteller first and foremost, that the difference is that the story that you are telling is tethered to a reality that cannot be changed, right? If you were never in Utah, then that's not a work of nonfiction. But if you were there for 48 hours instead of 56 hours, or, you know, if you're collapsing time and collapsing characters, then so what? But to me, really, there's only two genres of writing: good writing and bad writing.
Reza, Geoff was saying that for him, it's sitting at the typewriter, whether he's writing fiction or non-fiction, and there's no distinction. The unpublished novel, did that feel different in its process to you?
Yes, it did. Yeah. It did. Yeah, it did. It did because, for me, my nonfiction requires so much research that, you know, every sentence I have, you know, 4 or 5 books on my desk. I can't just simply grab a pen and a piece of paper and go sit in a meadow somewhere.
This is one of the irritating things when people, you say you're writing a book, and they say, are you going to go off to a cottage in Wiltshire or something? And I just you have to take a sort of removal van. Exactly.
Depends. Do they have internet? Do they have Wi-Fi? But you know, I think that really it has so much more for me to do with the reader's expectation than it does with the writer himself, right? I mean, our sole responsibility is to the story, and oftentimes what happens is that because the reader is expecting something, because on the front of the book it says, you know, novel or memoir or what have you, is that it transforms the work that you've done in a somewhat unfair way. You know, you mentioned Kate Boo's book, which if you haven't read, you should all go out and get because it's fantastic. But if you took Kate's book and you just wrote a novel, it would be just as good and just as true. But I think that when you say this is a work of nonfiction, that these people are real and that the events that are described are all true, it adds this layer, this sort of voyeuristic element for the reader. They get the opportunity to feel as though they are looking into, you know, someone's window and watching what's, you know, a world that they would have otherwise no access to. And for some reason, that then makes it more real or more true than it would if it were just a work of fiction.
Antony, in your work, your work has been much praised on its paciness, that you're taking complicated and difficult stories, that you are doing huge amounts of research in far-flung archives. But at the end of the day, what is presented to the reader is not doesn't feel academic. It's written stylishly. You're attempting to write a work of literature, and it has pace. You stop at the end of a chapter on a cliffhanger. You move your characters. You develop your characters. Are you basing your writing on novelists? Are you learning from the novel or cinema?
I in fact started by writing novels, and later on, when writing history, what one wants to do to a certain degree is to reproduce the experience of what it was like for people at the time, and particularly those, say, trapped between the horrors of, say, Stalin and Hitler, who had no control over their own lives. You want to recreate that so that the people can understand, in a post-totalitarian age, in a post-military age, what it was like for them at the time. But, I mean, on the subject of sort of definitions between fiction and non-fiction, it means, of course, you cannot make anything up, but you can give the novelistic impression through the research. You know exactly what the weather was like on that particular day from diaries, you know the topography and so forth. So you can describe it almost in a novelistic fashion and yet be entirely loyal to the truth.
Richard Holmes apparently has who's here today, apparently has on his desk a little quote in front of him as he's writing, along the lines of, you cannot say it is a sunny day unless you have a diary reference to it.
He's absolutely right.
But if you're writing a narrative, is a problem, because often you do want to say it's a sunny day, or it's cold, or X is shivering, or, you know.
But you do want to be able to produce that sort of background. But we are into a dangerous area. I mean, Neil Ferguson controversially said that all historical fiction corrupts. Which is very sweeping and I'm afraid over the top thing. But at the same time, one's got to be careful to a certain degree about the dangers of historical fiction. When you start bringing in real characters and then putting thoughts into their mouths and thoughts into their heads, and which are completely invented, because the reader then has no idea what is true and what is invented. Now, should they change font in the thing so that one knows what's actually been made up and what hasn't? Or should they follow the roman clé and actually change names? Somebody wrote a novel in the States about Laura Bush. Now, they were able to go much further by changing the name. Everybody knew it was based on Laura Bush. But Justin Cartwright did a wonderful novel about Adam von Trott and Isaiah Berlin and their friendship. But he changed the names, so you were able to recognize entirely the characters, the situation, and everything like that. But you didn't have that trouble of having to keep reminding yourself this is fiction, not non-fiction.
Do you get frustrated ever in your non-fiction by absences in the sources?
Well, of course, everybody. We'd love to be omniscient. We'd love to be omniscient. And this is one of the reasons why history can never be a science. It is a branch of literature. And one often has this argument in Scandinavia or in Germany.
Or here, they would dispute.
Where there is sort of rigorous idea that history is a branch of science. It cannot be.
Could I say something about this Antony Lucas book, which I've just read, which is so amazing?
Pick it up again.
Oh, yeah. So the Antony Lucas book, Common Ground, it's about busing in Boston, you know, that thing where they attempted to integrate schools in Boston by busing white kids to black schools and vice versa. And he does this in a way, in the classic non-fiction way, by using 3 families to tell this story. And it took him 7 years to write this book, and I'm told, and this might be an apocryphal story, but apparently about 3 years in, he realized that one of the families he'd chosen wasn't working properly for his narrative desires. And of course, he's got to tell a true story. He can't get this family to, you know, do something that they didn't do. So he dropped them and got another family. Yeah. So that is the kind of high stakes game that that is going on in some non-fiction.
Yeah, so on that exact same point, a lot of people ask me, well, why isn't there more about Mary Magdalene in my book about Jesus? Because it's not fiction. That's why. I mean, if you want the fictional version of Jesus, then read Dan Brown. But the truth is we know absolutely nothing about Mary Magdalene at all, except that she was a disciple of Jesus's. And so I would have loved to, in a narrative fashion, written about, this amazing relationship, but it just simply didn't happen, so it's not there.
But the terrifying thing is, and this shows again the grey area between fact and fiction, was when 50% of the British population actually believed that Mary Magdalene had a child by Jesus.
Yeah,
thanks to Dan Brown.
Because of Dan Brown, the great historian, Dan Brown.
I know, it's terrifying.
But Antony, why do you think this has happened? Because there is a change between the sales patterns and the reading patterns of the 1930s, 1940s, even the 1960s.
Yes.
And what was changing, certainly in Britain, between about 1980 and the current. And I think in India, certainly, we've seen that change over the last 10 years. All the big Indian writers who were writing in the 1980s, the Salman Rushdie, Vikram Seth, Amitav Ghosh generation, were all novelists. Suddenly now you're getting those Sonia Falero, Basharat Peer, and a whole Pankaj Mishra, and a whole variety of writers who are big stars of non-fiction. We were meant to have on this panel Rana Dasgupta, whose new book on Delhi, capital, looks set to be the big non-fiction book of next year, but sadly he's got flu, and he's sitting in a hotel room miserably, but sends you all your greetings.
But there's a fundamental paradox.
But why did it happen? Yeah.
Well, no, but there is a fundamental paradox which I don't quite understand, and that is the sales of non-fiction outselling fiction. And yet women, on the whole, tend to read fiction much more than men, and tend to buy books more than men, and yet non-fiction is outselling. So, I mean, there are some things which I don't quite understand in the pattern, but certainly it's true that I think women are reading much more non-fiction than they did in the past, and that may be one of the big contributory factors.
And could you just talk a little bit about this prize, which is not well known here? I think in Indian papers, people follow the Booker every year, largely because there's almost always an Indian on it. The same is true probably the Pulitzer, which is reported here, particularly if someone like Siddharth Mukherjee wins as one on cancer. Samuel Johnson, though, is a prize which is not covered here. Can you talk about this? Again, came up to reflect this Renaissance.
Well, Samuel Johnson, in fact, to a certain degree, followed what had been the, what was it called before, NCR prize. And it was the big non-fiction prize, the equivalent of the Booker. And then various people feeling that when the NCR came to an end, they felt that there had to be a replacement. And so a number of characters, leading characters in the world of publishing, found some wonderful benefactor who didn't want to have his name necessarily attached to it or anything like that. And it developed in a way which suddenly, back in 1999, I think, when it started, and since then, of course, it has done a tremendous amount of showing basically the way that non-fiction, in all of its forms, from science through to history, through to biography and so forth, is, if you like, just as exciting as fiction. And it's had that effect, and I think it's been supremely successful.
It has the tagline of its campaign is always, all the best stories are true.
True, yes, which I think is a wonderful tagline. But anyway.
Yes, not every, I think I saw Simon Sharma was objecting to this. It's obviously not true. But
well, anyway.
Geoff, you've been resisting the idea that there's much difference in your writing life between the two genres. But I was on stage last week in Madras with Colin Thubron, who said that after writing, he writes alternately a travel book, then a novel, a travel book, then a novel. And he says that they operate out of different sides of his brain, that he's using one whole faculty that in his travel books. It involves research, it involves going there, and it's all in the first-person pronoun. And then he needs, at the end of that, to write a novel in a sense to clear his palate. Even though his travel books outsell his novels many, many times and have a much larger audience. You don't have any of that in your...
Well, I mean, I guess there's several things going on. I mean, I wrote this... let me just get... So, well, I guess the other thing I would do is... It's I talk a little bit about this relationship with publishers. The idea that you might do things to keep your publishers happy is just so anathema to me. And, you know, I mean, so in a way, and I can see that there's, I mean, whenever I talk to students about my writing life, the first thing I'd say is always, don't try this at home. Because the idea is that, yeah, there's meant to be some sort of continuity of readership. And really, from the first what I sort of managed to do really quite fantastically, I'm almost proud of it with my first 6 or 7 books, is that I managed to completely leave behind any small readership with one book that I might have had for the previous one.
For those who are not familiar with your bibliography, just give an idea of the range of stuff.
I'll give a sense of this. So I wrote a book about jazz, whereupon I could have become a jazz scholar, I guess. I think then I wrote a novel. Then I wrote a book about the First World War. The logical thing would have followed that up with the Second World War, but I think then I wrote a book about D.H. Lawrence. Then I wrote this travel book, well, this is where the sort of point I was going to make, called Yoga for People Who Can't Be Bothered to Do It. And that was quite sort of successful, because it was a sort of druggy travel book, and, you know, people like drugs. So, you know, that was... And then I wrote this, the next book was a history of photography. And I really wish I had on record a sort of video of my editor's face when he saw that the follow-up to this travel book was going to be a very straightforward history of photography. And now I'll get back to answering Willie's question. For the first time ever, having finished that book about photography, I then started to write a novel, and for the first time ever I did have some trouble swapping back from non-fiction writing to fiction, because I found that every sentence I was writing, these words like however, moreover, kept coming up. So so it would go things like, he crossed the room, however, he'd left.
On the other hand.
He saw her, moreover. Anyway, so there was a bit of sort of...
Therefore he walked back.
Yeah, there was a stiffness there. But, I mean, okay, I managed to limber up into a more fictive mode. But then the other thing that, just to tell you another brief publishing story, when I moved publisher for that for that novel, because I was, you know, getting on a bit, and like an aging footballer who's increasingly injury prone, when he makes a big money transfer, they want to make sure that he's not injured. They said, what are you going to do next? And then, even though I know that I hate having contracts, I signed a contract to write a book about tennis, even though at my age I should know that I hate having a contract over me. Anyway, and in no time at all I realized I didn't want to write a book about tennis. And then I was in this was just awful. And then, but it happened that then there was a screening again of this Russian film Stalker by Andrei Tarkovsky, and I found that for some reason, just for fun, because it was a ludicrous thing, I just started summarizing this film Stalker. I started summarizing a film that relatively few people have seen. And then this was kind of making me happy, even though there was no way that this would be publishable. And then I kept summarizing this film, and gradually I realized, oh, there's a book here. And at some point when my publishers started to say, how's the book going, referring to the tennis book, I was able to say absolutely honestly, it's going brilliantly. What I didn't say to them is that the book about tennis has become a book about Tarkovsky. And just to give them, you know, full credit, they could legitimately, I suppose, have said that I'd not fulfilled the terms of my contract. But actually, when I handed in this book about Tarkovsky, a book with zero potential, commercial potential, they agreed to publish it because they realized that what gives their life meaning is making me happy. And I think all this talk of you know, how many billions of copies you know, are sold, I think there is a different kind of success, which is to be able to, you know, I felt that publishing that book about Tarkovsky, that was a kind of success that Dan Brown couldn't have dreamed of. To be able to be allowed to publish a book that almost nobody wanted to read seemed to me, I thought that was some sort of high watermark of achievement in my life.
Did you ever regret your Olga Chekova book? I mean, I presume that it sold a fraction
Oh,
of...
yes, and it sold time out. No, I didn't at all, and I think I was very pleased to do it. But I mean, the interesting thing is, and this entirely supports what Geoff was saying, there's nothing more irritating than when a journalist asks you, who are you writing for? And the answer has to be, I'm writing for myself. You know, you write the sort of book that you want to write, you want to read yourself. And, you know, that's why Geoff writes the wonderful books he does.
Keeps them happy. I think probably the moment has come to open it out to the audience. So please, in the front row here. Yeah, we need a microphone though. Any microphones? Any team workies here?
Here it comes. I don't think she can make it up there.
Ooh.
Hang on, it's coming, it's here.
Here it comes.
Yep.
Oh, it's the Olympic torch.
We're not letting you off the hook now.
Thank you for that wonderful discussion. I couldn't resist asking the question of which really is, for all panelists, which is your favorite or one of your favorite non-fiction novels? And in the answering of that question, perhaps you could identify essential one or two elements that a non-fiction novel really must have. And the second quick question
of our own work or
any non-fiction, because we've heard enough about your work, but but any non-fiction, really any non-fiction that really caught your fancy. And the other thing I was curious about from the panelists is, you know, where do you place a man like Richard Kapuscinski when you think about non-fiction? Because as great as he was, one of the biggest criticisms about him was that he embellished the truth and that he took literary license even in his journalistic reportage. And yet he was riveting and extremely interesting. So I just was curious from the panelists, and Reza, because you write in such difficult themes and invite unintentional hostility, the easiest question I'm going to ask you is, just for the uninitiated audience in Jaipur, what are Twinkies?
What are Twinkies? You know, I don't think that there's an answer to that question. I don't think anyone can tell you exactly what a Twinkie is, so I won't even try. It's something that Americans eat. It's why we're so fat. I'll answer the very quick one. So I think probably the nonfiction book that I've read recently in the last few years that I love the most is Servidia's Shadow by Paul Theroux. And I'll tell you one very quick thing about that. It's an amazing, incredible book about the writing life and about this relationship between these two writers, mentor and disciple. But when you read the book, the genius of it is that it begins in third person with fake names. Chapter 1 is about a sort of a fake Indian, Trinidadian novelist and a fake American novelist in some country in Africa, and they're meeting. And it's in third person. And then the chapter ends, and chapter 2 begins in the same way. The first paragraph is in third person, and then it just stops. and Thoreau says, wait, you know who I am, and you know who I'm writing about, and there's nothing about this story that's going to be made any better by continuing to pretend that this is a novel and not a memoir. And the genius of it is that there is absolutely zero difference in the truth or facts relayed in chapter 1, which is in third person and in novel form, and in chapter 2, which is in first person and in memoir form. That's good writing. And that's what I've been talking about.
Do you want to tell the best story in that, which is the Vedmeta VS
I just met Vedmeta, which is like this greatest experience. So the thing about all writing, fiction or nonfiction, journalism or history, all writing has one goal, and that is to reveal character. It's all about the revelation of a character. Whether that character is a real person or a fake person, it doesn't really matter. And what's brilliant about this particular book is that, there have been so much written about Naipaul, but what's brilliant about Thoreau's book is that it tells you who he truly is. And one of the great stories about it is this very famous story, which I belly laughed in which the person who's telling Thoreau this story is at a dinner party, and the guest of honor is Vedmeta. And Vedmeta, for those of you who don't know, is blind. And this person says, I can't believe that Vedmeta is blind. He can't be blind. The way that he writes, the descriptions that he uses, it's so
rich, evocative.
Evocative, that I just can't believe it. So he decides he's going to prove that Vedmeta is not blind. So he sort of insinuates himself into the conversation that Meta is having. And while Vedmeta is talking, he gets closer and closer to his face, and he starts to put his hand in his face, and he puts his finger in his face,
rubs his nose.
Yeah, then eventually it gets so outrageous that he is right up to Vedmeta, and he's going anything. And then Vedmeta doesn't make any kind of response whatsoever, continues just talking as though he's not there. And then as he leaves, he says to the host, man, I really thought Vedmeta was not blind, but I guess he is. And the host says, that's not Vedmeta, that's V.S. Naipaul.
Everything you need to know about Naipaul. Geoff.
Well, interestingly, my answer to the first part of your question was going to be a Kapuscinski book. So the second part of that sort of rendered that. But anyway, so I'll go for a different choice.
Which one?
I think The Shadow of the Sun. That would be my... they're all great, though, yeah. I think. But actually, I'll go for a different choice now, even though it's really... and the great thing is, because I'm not a publisher, I don't have to try to sell this book to you. So here's the bad news. It's a 1,200-page history of Yugoslavia. But the key test of non-fiction is that, is that whether you can read a book about a subject that you've absolutely zero interest in. So this is a pretty stiff test of that. And so it's, of course, Black Lamb, Grey Falcon by Rebecca West. And I think this is quite an interesting book in the context of this conversation because of what it says about sort of reputations and the status of forms. I read English at university, and in a sense, of course, we didn't read Rebecca West because, as a novelist, she's, quite clearly not up there with, Lawrence Joyce or whoever. But what it never occurred to me that there was this other book by her, this History of Yugoslavia, it was sort of ineligible on the English course because we were reading fiction. It's not really a conventional history book, but within 100 pages, what you'll realize is that it's not just an absolute masterpiece, but I believe one of the great imaginative works of non-fiction of the 20th century. And it'll only take you 6 months to read.
Anthony.
Well, I have to follow in this area where you were talking, in fact, of fiction, non-fiction. And in fact, of course, a great travel book, and Paddy Lee Fermer's A Time of Gifts, which Willie probably knows better than I do, but it was one of the most extraordinary pieces of writing. and it's been rewritten and rewritten. I mean, one of the most fascinating things is actually to look at the original manuscripts, and you can understand why his publisher nearly pulled all of his hair out, because it was worse than Balzac. I mean, you know, different paragraphs moved around.
Quick sales pitch here. We have Patchouli Fermor is a writer that is almost completely unknown in India. I've seen his work in virtually no bookshops in this country. Tomorrow, Antony's wife, Artemis Cooper, will be talking about the travel writing of Patchouli Fermor. Go to that session, whatever you do. He is one of the greatest masters of English prose this century, and it'll be a complete treat. I mean, Time of Gifts is spectacular.
It is the prose. Yeah. I mean, the language, which actually translates very well into French and Spanish.
My wife originally read it in French and thought he was a French novelist.
Yes, but it has that same Baroque
not Time of Gifts, but the Violon de Saint-Jacques.
The Violon de Saint-Jacques, yes, which was then turned into an opera. Yeah. But no, anyway, it is the most superb travel book. Obviously, you can pin down certain areas where, as many travel writers, and I won't go any further on this particular subject, might have invented or embellished one or two aspects of their journey. But the point is this astonishing learning which comes through this joy of knowledge and understanding, and whether it's a question of meeting counts and countesses in their castles or shepherds in the mountainside, you have everything there, and it's one of the greatest educations you could imagine.
I write three different kinds of non-fiction, I suppose. I write travel books, history books, and journalism, and I'll just give a quick threesome of one of each genre. My favorite history book, again, a book not at all, a writer not known in this country at all, but the book which totally inspired Last Mughal, is a book called The Fall of Constantinople, 1453, by a writer called Sir Stephen Runciman, who for me is the greatest medieval historian I've ever read. He again has this knack of being able to take a period, in his case in the ancient past, 1453 is 500 years ago, but to populate it with characters who you can immediately recognize on the page and whose fates you are concerned with. And the genius of this book is that not only is it an exciting story, the fall of the great city of Constantinople to the Turks, with amazing characters, Romanus Diogenes, the last emperor, fighting to his death on the walls, Suleiman the Magnificent, moving his boats into the Golden Horn. It's a spectacular story. But you know that it's going to end in complete tragedy, that the Byzantines are all going to be led into slavery, and that Constantinople will be conquered. And so you have, in the sense that you sometimes have with a novel, is like The God of Small Things, where you open with the ending, where already you know that it's going to end very, very badly indeed, and you're following these characters in their last months. Another travel book, I would have taken Time of Gifts, but second writer who was a great friend of Patchouli Fermor, Bruce Chatwin's In Patagonia. Again, an extraordinary book by an extraordinary writer who writes incredible prose, but he reinvented the travel book. Lee Fermor and Chatwin were friends, but they write at the different opposite ends of the writing spectrum. Paddy has great waterfalls of verbs, and they are fantastic, long, descriptive passages of Baroque architecture in the snow. Chatwin is precise, clipped. You know that this tiny book has been cut down from a much larger manuscript. Every sentence contains the shadow of 5 sentences that were edited out, and you have that, and it leaves this very powerful prose, like in a poem, contains huge power in each word and each sentence, and he's a master writer. And finally, as a piece of journalism, magazine journalism, we mentioned Truman Capote earlier. After he did In Cold Blood, he did another non-fiction novella. It's an extended magazine piece that was originally written, I think, for Esquire. And to me, it's 1,000,000 times better than In Cold Blood, which I love. I'm a huge Capote fan. And it's called Handmade Coffins. And the difference between it's in a collection of his journalism called Music for Chameleons. And the difference between Handmade Coffins and In Cold Blood is it's a serial killer, and Capote arrives halfway through the series of murders. So people are being killed around him in really gruesome and bizarre ways. One guy has a rattlesnake put in his car, and he gets bitten, and he's found bloated in the car the following day. And it's, again, for me, my favorite magazine story.
We've been discussing about the topics like you write on gods, you wrote on Jesus, and you said that half of the books were purchased only so that people could read and hate that. The fact is that sometimes it does happen that people do write on their real experiences, real life experiences, categorizing them as non-fiction, but sooner they realize that commercially people don't know about them, or no one would be interested in reading their life. So commercial point of view, they just shift their non-fiction thing to the fiction category. They change certain characters, bits and pieces. How justified it is, you think, from commercial angle to shift your title from non-fiction to fiction?
In a sense, that's a question for Geoff, as someone that...
Could you summarize the question?
The question was taking a non-fiction subject and writing it effectively as a novel. I think of Jeff in Venice and...
Yeah,
Well, rather like Robert Harris.
Maybe explain the game you were playing in Geoff in Venice and Death and Baronessy.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah. Actually, I don't feel quite confident about my answer. Maybe you could come up with an answer.
You're getting signals from...
Oh, we've been told to cut.
Yes.
We have to finish now?
Oh,
I'm afraid we have to finish right now.
Quick, last... No, don't talk about...
Well, I end where I began, really, by saying for me, it's pretty much the same thing, really, and the proportion of made-up stuff to documentary stuff is pretty consistent throughout my fiction and non-fiction.
There's your answers then. Thank you very much. Reza, Aslan.
I'm sorry to cut the session
Beevor,
off.
Geoff Dyer.
Perhaps we can continue with any questions you may have at the book signing tent. Sign books for you. You'll find them in the far left corner here at the back of the front lawns. Their books are all available in the Full Circle bookshop. Thank you so much to Antony Beevor, Geoff Dyer, Reza Aslan, and William Dalrymple.